Every country on Earth is drowning in debt. The United States, $38 trillion. Japan, $9 trillion. The entire planet, 315 trillion, 3 times the size of the global economy. But here's the question that should haunt you: if everyone owes money, who exactly are they paying? Follow the chain of creditors, track who actually holds the debt, and you'll discover something that will fundamentally change how you see the world. The global economy doesn't owe money to anyone in particular. It owes money to itself. And four financial architects across 3 centuries, designed it that way, deliberately. They built a system where debt can never be repaid, where governments borrow forever, where interest flows eternally upward. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The meetings happened. The contracts exist. The mechanisms are public record. Let me show you the 4 architects, the 4 innovations, and why 38 trillion isn't a crisis. It's the system working exactly as designed. Before 1694, kings borrowed the old way. They'd promise repayment with interest to merchants or nobles. If they couldn't pay, they'd default. Creditors lost money. The system cleared. William Paterson changed everything. He was a Scottish merchant who'd failed multiple times to get rich. But in 1691, he had an idea that would reshape civilization itself. England was at war with France. King William III desperately needed money. The treasury was empty, and traditional lenders were refusing new loans because England had defaulted before. Paterson approached the king with a revolutionary proposal. He would organize wealthy merchants to lend the government £1.2 million, about 300 million in today's money. But here's the innovation that changed history. The loan would never be repaid. Instead, the government would pay 8% interest, forever. And to manage this arrangement, Paterson proposed creating a new institution, the Bank of England. The mechanics were brilliant. Merchant lenders give gold to the Bank of England. The bank lends it to the government. The government pays interest from tax revenue. The bank distributes that interest to the lenders, but the principal never repaid, ever. Why would merchants accept this? Because the interest was guaranteed by Parliament, backed by the government's power to tax its citizens. As long as England could collect taxes, the money would flow, and the banknotes they received could be traded. They were better than gold, because they paid interest. Parliament approved in 1694. And for the first time in history, national debt became permanent. Not a problem to solve, a feature of the system. But here's what nobody explains. The Bank of England was given the right to issue banknotes backed by the government's debt. They could print paper money up to the value of the loan. This created money out of debt. The government's IOU became currency, and the more the government borrowed, the more money could be created. Within 50 years, every major European power copied the model. France, the Netherlands, and by 1790, the newly independent United States. Alexander Hamilton explicitly modeled America's financial system on the Bank of England. Paterson died in 1719, not particularly wealthy, but his system persists 331 years later. The Bank of England still exists. British government debt has never been paid off, only refinanced, rolled over, and expanded. The trap was set. By the early 1800s, European governments had embraced debt, but there was no organized market. Each loan was negotiated individually, and only the wealthiest merchants could participate. Nathan Rothschild industrialized it. The Rothschild family started as money changers in Frankfurt. By 1800, the 5 Rothschild brothers had established banking houses in 5 major European cities: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This network was unprecedented. They could move money across borders faster than anyone else, and Nathan Rothschild in London was the strategic genius. His innovation: instead of lending directly to governments, he bought government bonds at a discount and resold them to investors at a markup. He created a secondary market. Government needed money. Rothschild provided it immediately. Then he sold the bonds to pension funds, insurance companies, and wealthy individuals. Government got fast cash. Rothschild collected the spread. Investors got tradable assets. But here's where it gets darker. In 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild learned of Napoleon's defeat before anyone else in London. His courier network was faster than official channels. He used this information ruthlessly. First, he sold British bonds, signaling Britain was losing. Prices collapsed. Panicked investors sold. Then, after prices crashed, Rothschild bought massive quantities at rock-bottom prices. When news of British victory arrived the next day, bond prices surged. Rothschild made millions. This established the Rothschild model: control the information, control the issuance, control the market. By 1820, the Rothschilds dominated European sovereign debt. If a government needed to borrow, they went through the Rothschilds. Here's why this matters for the debt trap. Before Rothschild, governments could theoretically default. If a king refused to pay, his creditors lost money and the system reset. But Rothschild made sovereign debt tradable across borders. A British bond might be owned by a French investor who sold it to a German bank, who used it as collateral for a loan to an Austrian aristocrat. The web of ownership became so complex that defaulting wasn't just refusing one creditor. It was collapsing an entire international financial network. This is the Rothschild innovation. Make debt so interconnected that default becomes impossible. Not because governments are responsible, but because default would trigger systemic collapse. Governments became trapped. They had to keep paying, and they had to keep borrowing to pay the interest on old debts. The debt trap was no longer just permanent, it was inescapable. By 1900, America was an economic powerhouse with a primitive financial system. Banks operated independently. Money supply was tied to gold, and there was no central mechanism to manage debt. J.P. Morgan fixed that, not for the public good but to protect his banking empire. In 1907, a financial panic struck. Stock prices crashed, banks failed, the economy seized up. Morgan personally organized a bailout. He gathered the major New York bankers in his library, locked the doors, and forced them to pledge their own money to stabilize failing banks. It worked. The panic ended. Morgan became the de facto central banker of America, but he was 70 years old. He knew he couldn't do it again. So Morgan and his associates designed a permanent solution. They needed a central bank, but Americans hated central banks. The first and second banks of the United States had been shut down by populist opposition, so Morgan's group disguised it. In 1910, Morgan's associates, including Senator Nelson Aldrich and representatives from the largest banks, held a secret meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia. For 9 days, they designed what would become the Federal Reserve System. The meetings were secret because they knew if the public discovered that bankers were designing the nation's monetary system, there would be riots. The plan was brilliant political manipulation. It wouldn't be called a central bank. It would be the Federal Reserve System, not one institution, 12 regional banks. Not controlled by Wall Street, overseen by presidential appointees, it looked decentralized, democratic, public. But the structure ensured banker control. The regional Federal Reserve banks were privately owned by member banks. Those banks elected the boards. And the most important power, creating money and buying government bonds, was given to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, controlled by the largest Wall Street banks. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December 1913, largely because most representatives didn't understand what they were voting for. and immediately, the debt trap expanded. Here's why this matters. Before the Federal Reserve, there was a limit to how much the government could borrow. Banks only had so much money to lend. But the Federal Reserve could create money by purchasing government bonds. Government issues a bond. The Fed buys it with newly created money. Government spends the money. The debt goes on the Fed's balance sheet. This is the mechanism that enables infinite debt. The Federal Reserve ensures there's always a buyer for government bonds, always demand. So the government never has to stop borrowing. It can roll over debt forever because the Fed will always buy it. Morgan died in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was created. But his legacy is the structure that makes the current $38 trillion in U.S. debt possible. The debt trap became infinite. By the 1970s, the debt system was functioning globally. Every developed nation borrowed, rolled over debt, and paid interest. But developing nations were different. They borrowed for infrastructure, and many couldn't keep up with payments. Paul Volcker made the trap permanent. Volcker was Federal Reserve Chairman from 1979 to 1987. He faced a crisis, inflation over 10%, eroding U.S. credibility, foreign governments losing faith in the dollar. So in 1979, Volcker raised interest rates dramatically, from 11% to 20%, the highest in American history. This crushed inflation, but it had another effect. Developing nations had borrowed billions in dollars during the 1970s when rates were low. Now those loans were due, and interest rates had tripled. Mexico owed $80 billion, Brazil $60 billion, Argentina $40 billion, and they couldn't pay. The interest alone exceeded their export revenues. In August 1982, Mexico announced it couldn't make payments. Default. This should have triggered global financial collapse. American banks had lent most of that money. If Mexico defaulted, Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, all would take massive losses. Some might fail. Volcker could have let it happen. Let the banks take losses. Let the market clear. But he didn't. Instead, he orchestrated a bailout through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF would lend Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and others enough money to keep making interest payments to American banks. These were called structural adjustment loans, and they came with brutal conditions: cut government spending, privatize state assets, open markets to foreign investment, devalue currencies. Basically, dismantle economic sovereignty in exchange for the money to keep paying interest. And here's the key: the IMF loans didn't reduce debt. They just rolled it over, made it manageable but permanent. This is the Volcker innovation. When debt becomes unpayable, don't forgive it, restructure it. Lend enough to keep interest payments flowing, and extract political and economic concessions in exchange. The debt trap became a tool of control. Countries that couldn't pay were forced to open their economies, sell their assets, and submit to foreign economic policy, all for the privilege of staying in debt. This pattern has repeated for 40 years. Greece in 2010, Argentina in 2001, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every time the same structure: IMF loans to keep paying interest, austerity imposed, sovereignty surrendered, and the debt never eliminated, just restructured into perpetual indebtedness. Volcker died in 2019. But his legacy is the mechanism that ensures the debt trap is global and inescapable. Now let me show you how these four architects built a system where debt is infinite and escape is impossible. Start with Paterson's model 1694, government borrows, pays interest forever, never repays principal. Add Rothschild's innovation 1815, make the debt tradable globally. Create a web where default collapses the system. Add Morgan's mechanism 1913, central banks create money to buy government bonds. Unlimited demand, government can always borrow more. Add Volcker's trap 1982, when countries can't pay, restructure. Don't forgive, keep the interest flowing. The result is what we have today, 315 trillion in global debt, government debt, corporate debt, household debt. None of it will ever be repaid. All of it pays interest, and all of it is connected through the financial system, so default anywhere threatens collapse everywhere. The U.S. government has 38 trillion in debt. Who owns it? About 20 trillion is owned by the American public pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, banks, the Federal Reserve. These institutions buy treasury bonds because they're considered safe assets, but those bonds pay interest, about 1 trillion per year right now. That interest comes from taxes. So taxpayers send money to the government. The government sends it to bondholders. The bondholders are mostly institutions owned by the wealthy. It's a transfer from workers to capital every year. Forever. The other 18 trillion is owed to the government itself, Social Security, Medicare trust funds. The government borrowed from these programs and spent the money. Now it owes itself. But ultimately, taxpayers owe. Because when Social Security needs to redeem those bonds, the government has to raise taxes or borrow more to pay. Now scale it globally. Japan owes 9 trillion, mostly to Japanese institutions and the Bank of Japan. Europe owes 14 trillion, mostly to European banks and the ECB. China has significant domestic debt held by state banks. Every country is running the same system, and they're all interconnected. Japan holds U.S. treasuries. The U.S. holds European bonds through the IMF. Europe holds developing nation debt through the World Bank. It's circular. Everyone owes everyone. And the interest flows upward to the institutions that manage the debt. Here's the truth most people don't understand. If the U.S. paid off its 38 trillion, the money supply would collapse. Why? Because dollars are created when the government borrows. If it paid off the debt, those dollars would disappear. Deflation, depression, economic collapse, so the government can never pay it off. It has to keep borrowing, keep rolling it over, and keep paying interest. The same is true globally. If every government paid off its debt, the global money supply would shrink by 2/3. There wouldn't be enough money to conduct trade. The system would seize. So debt can't be eliminated, it's structural, necessary, by design. Who profits? The institutions that hold the debt. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity. These asset managers control tens of trillions. They buy government bonds with other people's money, pension funds, retirement accounts, insurance premiums, and they collect the interest, about 1 trillion per year from U.S. debt alone, plus interest from Japan, Europe, everywhere. That trillion per year in interest payments flows from taxpayers to bondholders. It's the largest wealth transfer in history. Continuous, structural, and invisible to most people, because it's not called a tax, it's called debt service. But it's the same mechanism. Workers pay, institutions collect, and the debt never decreases. The four architects didn't conspire together. They lived in different centuries. But they each solved a problem in a way that benefited the financial system. And each solution built on the previous one. Paterson made debt permanent, 1694. Rothschild made it global, 1815. Morgan made it infinite, 1913. Volcker made it inescapable, 1982. Together, they built a system where governments borrow forever and pay interest eternally. And the people who control the bonds, who manage the debt, who collect the interest, they're the ultimate beneficiaries. Not governments, not taxpayers, the financial institutions. Here's the final truth. 38 trillion isn't a crisis for them. It's a business model. Every dollar of debt is an asset on someone's balance sheet. It pays interest. It provides collateral for more borrowing. And as long as confidence holds, As long as people believe the government will pay interest even if it never repays principal, the system functions. The debt trap is complete. Escape isn't possible, not without collapsing the entire financial system. 4 architects, 3 centuries, 1 system, and everyone on Earth is now caught inside it. If this changed how you see government debt, if you finally understand that 38 trillion isn't an accident or a mistake, but a system working exactly as designed, then you're starting to see how power actually works. Because they're not going to teach you this in economics class. They're going to teach you that debt is a problem to solve. But the architects knew better. Debt isn't a problem, it's the foundation. And interest is the rent we pay to live in their system.